Greetings, folks, and welcome back to my little corner of the library. Our story today takes us back to 1493, when a book appeared out of a lucrative popular printing house in Nuremberg, Germany. Now, a massive folio-sized book, the Liber Chronicarum was a full history of the world, from the creation story all the way up to the then present day. But what made this book stand out, and what makes it stand out today, wasn't its subject matter. World histories were so commonplace in the Middle Ages that there had actually been a formula worked out for how to write one, so to see a new one come out wasn't all that original. No, what made this book different was its pictures. Featuring over 1,800 illustrations, it was one of, if not the most copiously illustrated books ever printed. Now, my name's Dan, this is Bookworm History, and this, which will take up about half the frame, is the Nuremberg Chronicle. Now, the story of the Nuremberg Chronicle is pretty big, possibly beyond the scope of a YouTube video. But in order to try and give as comprehensive a story as I can, we're going to approach this from 4 different angles. That of the patrons, the author, the print shop, and lastly, the artists. First up, the patrons. All of the work involved in producing the Nuremberg Chronicle, also referred to as the Liber Chronicarum, or the Book of Chronicles, from the writing to the printing to the producing of the woodblocks to the materials involved, was financed by 2 men, Siebold Schreyer and his brother-in-law, Sebastian Kammermeister. Now, Siebold Schreyer, his family was furriers, and they rose to some position of prominence within Nuremberg society, but Siebold from a young age realized that that wasn't really for him, and he chose to make his fortune in real estate dealings around Nuremberg, as well as dealings in finance. And with his affluence came other interests, specifically the burgeoning humanist movement. Now, in the late Middle Ages to early Renaissance, humanism was a term that referred to a revival of the ideas of the Greeks and Romans, and with that a focus more on hard sciences than had up to that point been really maintained. Specifically things like cartography, anatomy, biology, chemistry, cartography, etc. Another aspect of humanism was the idea that all of this knowledge that either newly found or newly regained should be shared, should be spread, and should be accumulated for the good of all mankind. And it's no real coincidence that this movement came about at the same time as the rise of the printed word. Siebold Schreyer, being a good humanist, would often host a gathering of Nuremberg scholars and visiting educated men in his home to discuss the latest advances in the sciences or the latest books that had hit the market. One of the more frequent attendees of these humanist gatherings was Nuremberg physician Hartman Sheetal. Hartman Sheetal was born in 1440. He would travel to Padua for his education, graduate in 1466, and return to Nuremberg, where his cousin Hermann had already started a medical practice. Hartman Sheetal, like Siebold Schreyer, was a devoted humanist, and would spend his time gathering various works of knowledge, although he spent more of his time focusing on the gathering as opposed to expounding upon them. He spent most of his time building up an absolutely massive library, and by the time he died, he had accumulated about 370 manuscripts and at least 600 printed books. And considering he died in 1514, and printing had only been around for about 65 years, give or take, 600 books is a lot for one guy to have. For all of his volumes, though, his skill with the pen wasn't that great. Again, he spent more time focused on collecting rather than expounding on things, so almost all of what he wrote in the Nuremberg Chronicle, almost the entire work, is ripped directly from other sources. So rather than calling him an author, it's almost more accurate description to say he was the compiler of the Nuremberg Chronicle. As Adrian Wilson writes in his book, The Making of the Nuremberg Chronicle, on the whole, Sheetal's text is scarcely more than an eclectic scholastic work in a thin humanist guise. It was a nice try, but others had done better. The Nuremberg Chronicle was printed in the house of Anton Coburger, and it makes sense that it would be. Nuremberg was an intellectual center at the end of the 15th century, and Anton Coburger was by far the most popular printer in the city. He was well on his way in 1493, when the book was printed, to becoming the most popular printer in Germany, and arguably one of the best in the world. When he died in 1526, the Coburger Press had 24 working presses, and dozens, almost 100 employees. If you were going to print something as labor-intensive as the Nuremberg Chronicle was going to be, there was really no other game in town. Okay, now to the big reason the Chronicle still endures. The art. The Nuremberg Chronicle features 1,809 illustrations, everything from the creation story to the Great Flood, pictures of kings and saints, royalty from all eras of history, as well as full cityscapes. Now, as impressive a number as 1,809 is, that's not actually the number of woodblocks that were used. You see, as far as the cityscapes go, and there are many of them throughout the Chronicle, there were 53 different woodblocks of cityscapes, used to represent 101 different places. As far as people goes, there were 96 different woodblocks of people, and they represented 593 different people. They were used on average 6 times each, some more, some less. Which kind of makes it a game. As you go through the Chronicle, it's fun to see exactly how often certain characters show up. These illustrations were done at the studio of Nuremberg artists Michael Wohlgemuth and Wilhelm Pleidenwerf. And the interesting thing about this studio, and by extension the Chronicle's art, is the discussion that comes up of exactly how involved a young Albrecht Dürer was in their creation. And without getting into a biography of Dürer, that's spoilers for a upcoming episode, he was the son of Nuremberg goldsmiths, and at the age of 15 he was apprenticed to Michael Wohlgemuth in his artist's studio. He remained there until 1490, leaving at the age of 19, and this would put him well within the time frame to have worked on some of the art for the Chronicle, although he left a full 3 years before the book would actually be published. So the question comes up, did Dürer work on the Nuremberg Chronicle? Now, that he was a very talented artist, even at the age of 15 when he started for Wohlgemuth, we know he absolutely was. That Wohlgemuth would have used everyone he could find for help and assistance on a project the size of the Nuremberg Chronicle seems almost certain. So to not use a talented young apprentice on something this big seems silly. Most historians concur that Dürer did have some influence on the art of the Chronicle, although exactly how much they still debate. But now, there are 2 contracts still in existence regarding the printing of the Nuremberg Chronicle that were signed before the book came out in 1493. And they date to 1491, which would seem to imply that work on the Chronicle only took 2 years, but that seems like a really tight schedule, and not very believable. So you dig further into the Nuremberg city archives, and you come up with documents that reference older contracts among this same group of people that produced the Chronicle. Now, the logical conclusion to draw from this is that there were other contracts that dictated the terms and conditions and agreements involved in producing the Chronicle, and they were signed before these other 2 that are still in existence. The earliest one that we have a reference to is from 1487, which would make 6 to 7 years the time frame for the work on the Chronicle, and this seems much more believable. Now, it's estimated that about 2,500 copies total of the Nuremberg Chronicle were printed. Of these, 1,500 of them were in Latin, and the remaining 1,000 were translated into German. Now, the translation was done by the Nuremberg city scribe Georg Alt, and the reason for that is, again, back to humanist principles. The idea was not to gather knowledge. The idea was to expound and spread knowledge. And a big part of that was the distribution of works, especially ancient texts in Greek and Roman, but also contemporary texts, and the writing of these and publishing and spreading of these within the vernacular. So it only makes sense that a humanist printing house, sponsored by a humanist patron and a book written by a humanist author, would publish in the common language of the people. Now, the book sold tolerably well, although it didn't completely sell out, and we know that because of the one remaining contract, the one that was signed after the book had been printed. Referred to as the Final Agreement of 1509, it officially closed the books on the Nuremberg Chronicle, distributed profits to all of the parties entitled to them, and tallied up exactly how many copies had remained unsold. Of the 1,500, approximately, Latin copies that were printed, 509 of them remained, and of the estimated 1,000 copies in German, 49 of them were still around. If you want more information on the Nuremberg Chronicle, and if you can get a hold of this, it's a book called The Making of the Nuremberg Chronicle by Adrian Wilson. It gives you a breakdown of the history behind the Nuremberg Chronicle, as well as a lot of information about the design of the book. It goes through in depth all of the exemplar copies. Several of the pages kind of shows you the interplay between the how the text and the pictures were all put together to form what would ultimately be printed as the Chronicle. If you're interested in the art of the Nuremberg Chronicle, you can also pick up a Dover edition. Those are the same people that printed some of the books that I have of Gustave Doré's illustrations, as well as Arthur Rackham, Albrecht Dürer, any of the more famous illustrators Dover has probably done some kind of an art book on. This one is medieval woodcut illustrations, city views and decorations from the Nuremberg Chronicle. It doesn't feature all of them, but it certainly hits the high points. And if you're interested in the art, you could pick up a copy of that as well. There are illustrations online. You can see the Nuremberg Chronicle in its entirety. You can find facsimile editions. I'll leave a link to one beautifully hand-colored that I rather enjoyed down in the description below. You can also find many copies of all of the different artwork that's been featured, all the different woodcuts that are featured within the Nuremberg Chronicle. You can find those online pretty easily, but I'll look for some good places and leave some links down in the description below. Well, that's all I've got for you today. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, please be sure to hit that subscribe button on your way out the door so you stay up to date on all of our latest episodes. Be sure to check out our blog over at BookwormHistory.com. I just put a piece up yesterday on the movement to have the United States Capitol moved from Washington, D.C. to St. Louis, Missouri. This movement took place in 1870 and was pretty interesting to read. There was quite a bit of buzz about this, specifically centered around one character in particular, a man named Logan Uriah Rebus. So if you're interested in that at all, be sure to head over to BookwormHistory.com for even more. I hope you enjoy the rest of your day, and thanks for stopping by. The book sold. Train. Gotta love the trains.